there is a catalytic piece the U.S. does that's important. You mentioned infrastructure. Development Finance Corporation has not been cast aside like USAID, as I understand it. So that, at least on the infrastructure side, there's an American player in the game.
We talked about Congress before. DFC is up for reauthorization. And my hope is that Congress is able to play a constructive role in really supercharging DFC and helping to create a culture at DFC that has been somewhat lacking since its stand-up midway through the first Trump administration of risk-taking when it comes to investments in the development space, right? DFC needs to, from my perspective, think of itself less of a white shoe Wall Street investment firm and more as an instrument of U.S. grand strategy. And that means taking on board investments that might not otherwise pass the test if you're managing a pension fund, but that are important for national security purposes, right? You're not going to get your 12% a year return, you're going to get 8%, but there are non-pecuniary compensation that goes along with it. But that also requires an ecosystem around DFC, former USAID, Commerce, TDA, State Department, that's able to help do the de-risking, provide the technical expertise and support so that partners can develop bankable deals that they can then take to DFC for financing. DFC doesn't have that part of the operation in-house. They were relying and have relied on other parts of the U.S. government to be able to do that for them, which are now going or gone.
Yeah. So, I don't know, and maybe it's not fair to ask you to predict, but sort of scenarios, expectations of what happens next. Australia folded AusAid, their version of USAID, into DFAT. A lot of people in the development world thought it was outrageous. From my perspective, I think it's working pretty well. And in some ways, they've found a good balance between that human security, humanitarian purpose of aid and the national interest, which taxpayers deserve. I suppose there is a scenario you could say, look, folding USAID into State Department might actually have long-term benefits, but you don't hear that very often. What's your expectation of what happens next?
My big issue with what we've done over the past several months in defenestrating AID and then picking up some specs from the sidewalk to fold into the State Department is that we approached what might be an otherwise perfectly reasonable thing to do in a completely astrategic and backwards way. For 20 years, multiple administrations of both Democratic and Republican have considered and thought about folding USAID into the State Department or other moves to better align the development and foreign assistance work with our diplomacy. I am personally not at all, against that. When USAID was created in 1961, it was at a particular point in time for a particular purpose and in a particular world that no longer exists, right? If we were sitting down with a blank sheet of paper today to design a development assistance institution for the world that we have in 2025 and what we expect in 2035, probably wouldn't look a lot like USAID. So the idea of redesign, realignment, and even folding AID into state, I have no theological objections to that. I think the problem is that we went about it in a particularly thoughtless way, right? We didn't start with asking the question about, so what are the functions that we as a government need to have? What are the capacities that we need to be able to build to pursue our foreign policy and national security interests and our values? What's the technical expertise? What's the human capital that we need to have to do that? We simply slashed and burned and threw everything into the trash can when we recognized that, actually, these functions are important for our national security. We're going to have to rebuild that. And the further problem is we're going to have to rebuild it at a time when we have no margin for error, right? The urgency of the competition that we face with the PRC, Russia as well, right, is so pressing that people are not going to wait a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years for us to get their act together, right? The world will have moved on. I think when you talk to friends and colleagues at DFAT, I think they got it more right than wrong, but it also took them a decade.
That's true.
Right? There were missteps along the way. There were challenges with how to integrate two very, very different work cultures. We don't have a decade to get this right.
Lee Kuan Yew famously said Americans think that international affairs is like watching a video. I don't know if that metaphor works anymore for younger listeners, but basically, Americans think you can stop the video in Asia and go do something in the Middle East and then come back and the movie will be where you left it when you turn it on again. And that's just not how things work. If you could redesign our development assistance bureaucracy and strategy, maybe a new Congress, maybe a new administration, who knows, maybe even this administration decide we need this. What are some of the things you prioritize? You can't do it the way we designed it in 1961. You can't do everything we were doing. You have to prioritize certain issue sets and regions. What would your elevator pitch be for what this new development capability, bureaucracy, architecture looks like?
I guess I start with, and even though this is maybe the tougher pitch, with a lot of the governance work that we did and that we need to continue to do, because I think without that, none of the rest is sustainable.
You can have the best designs for urban planning or lower Mekong, but if the Chinese can roll in and bribe the leaders to cancel it, you lose.
Oh, and it's also the pathway for trade, not aid, for countries. Pick your bumper sticker, right? Pathway to self-sufficiency, right? Which is ultimately what we want for our partners.
And relatively inexpensive compared to many development projects.
It's not about building a culture of dependency. It's about strong, independent partners. So that's
which, of course, is not just USAID. It's the NED. It's
there's a whole ecosystem.
Now defunct DRL.
Right. It's a whole ecosystem, all of which is under assault right now. But I think you've got to start with that as your fundamental building block. Other areas where there is sort of a big and immediate return on investment, the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief work. We talked about Indonesia briefly before. That is critical stuff. Life-saving work, whether it's in health or food assistance, right? Going back to President Reagan's "A Hungry Child Knows No Politics." The work that we did there, like with PEPFAR, for example, absolutely critical. And I'm hesitant to use this phrase, but in winning hearts and minds and in helping would-be partners to recognize that the United States, in fact, should be and would become their partner of choice. That is all work that is pennies, not even pennies, less, it's fraction of pennies on a dollar with outsized returns. And even if you want to be purely selfish about it, we want to stop diseases before they get to our shores. We want to address root causes that may lead to migration. I think there are plenty of reasons why we, as a country, want to do these things that have nothing to do with that sort of narrow set of arguments. But if you want to take it to the narrower set of arguments, that's there as well. And then lastly, right, the chapeau has to be sustainable economic development for free market, open systems of economic interchange. And there is a lot that can be done there where the model is not public sector driven development, but public-private partnerships that are, right, we talked about DFC before, that are teeing up the private sector for investment and success to be able to drive growth and development in the global South.
3 of those 4 priorities you just mentioned cannot be done by whatever replaces USAID alone. They require private sector for counter-corruption. They require NGOs. They require DOD for humanitarian relief. So I think one of the implications of what you're saying is people now studying to get a career in development at Georgetown or SAIS or Kennedy School. What I'm hearing you say is get out of your lane because the development world is not going to be the same. It's going to be a hybrid.
No. And I think this gets back to thinking about what does development look like in 2035 as opposed to in 1961 or 1991 or 2001. It is a different world that we now live in.
Michael Schiffer, one of the wise men of Washington on Asia. Really, really thoughtful. Really appreciate it. Good luck with everything. And we'll have you on again. See how we go. Thanks.